Hello, friends. It is officially Friday. That means we have survived another work week. Thank you so much for joining us on CANNAfact Friday as we ease you into the weekend. My name is Adriana Humans. I'm the VP of Demand at ISA, which is an insights firm based in Los Angeles, specializing in cannabis consumer insights. And I'm joined by my co-host, David Palaschuk, who is the author of the first book on cannabis branding called Branding Bud, the Commercialization of Cannabis. David is also a consultant who specializes in helping brands build more meaningful brands. Thank you for joining us, everybody. And David, why don't you tell the folks what we do here on CANNAfact Friday?
Absolutely. Boy, that was a mouthful. Thank you for that, Adriana.
It was, wasn't it? I don't think I took a breath that whole time.
Well, here we are, another Friday, CANNAfact Friday number 15. It's our 15th episode, and we're really excited with a really interesting guest. For those of you that don't know, Adriana specializes in insight and research and really brings lots of the data to us every week. And we look through that. We come together, we help our clients, we help our folks in the industry, and we sort of sort through and contextualize these things. As you know, in today's times, right, people take one data point and that's the truth, that's the North Star. And I think we know that you need more than one data point to get a full picture. So that's what we try to do here every Friday. We do that with industry influencers and folks that understand the market and can help us make sense out of that. So that's really what it's about, and we're excited to do that today. That said, there is a text box on the right side of your screen, and what we do, and as always, is ask you to participate. So those folks that are listening in, feel free to chime in with questions. We always run through our CANNAfact or CANNAfiction or CANNAchoice games that we do, so we'll ask you to participate in that. But that's what we do, and that's what we're here to do today, so we're pretty excited about that.
And we're also here to welcome a special guest. His name is Anthony Michael, and he is Associate VP of Social Analytics at Material, aka the mad scientist of data. Anthony has analyzed millions of online conversations about cannabis, and he's here today to share with us some of these insights. So welcome, Anthony.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Hey, Anthony.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. Excited to talk some consumer insights today.
Yeah. So we're off by sort of kicking us off with a little stat, a little guessing game that we like to do. But before we do that, maybe you could just tell us what is social analytics?
Yeah, absolutely. So social analytics is ultimately analyzing unprompted, anonymous conversations that take place online. So, when we talk about conversations online, typically the most detailed conversations and the ones that we typically leverage, those are ones happening on forums, blogs. Reddit is a great contributor for us. And these are places where consumers are having discussions about a whole host of different topics. And we collect those conversations and we use natural language processing and AI to ultimately sift through and find those signals in the noise of that online conversation.
That's so cool. And hi, Nikki. Thanks for joining us. So let's start off and throw up our first stat. This is a CANNAchoice multiple choice quiz question. And this was pulled from some data analysis that Anthony provided. This is looking at conversations about 4 different categories from the first half of 2021 to the second half of 2021. So the question is this: which of the following product categories is up 14% from the first half of 2021 to the second half of 2021 for exploring something new? And you can guess one of these 4. Please drop your guesses in the chat. The options are concentrates, edibles, flower, or vape. And if you have no idea, go ahead and take a guess. You have a 25% chance of getting it, which is much better odds than Vegas. So don't be shy.
And Anthony, would you just share a little bit, I guess, about the category, because we'll have these different categories. Exploring something new is pretty straightforward, but in the asking of these questions, or exploring or mining for these questions, is that the umbrella title?
Yeah, totally. So for exploring something new, what we're doing is we're looking for indicators in that online conversation that indicate that a consumer is talking about being adventurous wanting to try something new, maybe switching to, something that they don't have a whole lot of experience in. So, this conversation really is triggered by mentions of, first time, uh, wanting to try something new, so to speak. I know that's very obvious, but we're looking for those linguistic identifiers to ultimately get at that concept of switching between categories, venturing off in a new space, that type of thing.
Okay.
We have a lot of guesses in the chat, and it looks like there is an incredibly strong consensus. Every single person who guessed, which I think are 8 folks now, have all said option B, edibles. Y'all are really smart this week.
Right, and the answer is
Correct. Nice job, everybody. You guessed it correct. Maybe I'll be able to stump you later on. Let's read this quote from a real consumer from a real online conversation. This person said, first time with edibles, I smoke every day and have for 2 years. I picked this for $35. I know I have a high tolerance because I barely get high anymore. So that seemed like it was sort of the impetus for this person to try something new and see if they could re-experience that early feeling.
Yeah, I guess one thing I'd add too is that, going back to that idea of what the concept of trying something new means, one thing that I was seeing when I was reading the online conversation is that it could affect 2 completely different types of consumers. It could be someone that's bored with the same old and they want to kind of move into edibles and get a new experience. It could also be someone that has very limited capacity or knowledge of the cannabis category in general and is trying it out for the first time.
Yeah, we've seen that too, that edibles tend to be a really common entry point for first-time consumers.
and while not necessarily related to that particular quote, I'm guessing with a strong guess that the pandemic and the shift in where we spend our time and who we spend our time with, that also probably drives edibles up, discrete consumption versus non-discrete consumption. So it's interesting how edibles has really been the solution for many problems, if you will.
Yeah, we saw that category growing a lot among people who have children under 18 at home in the last couple of years.
Right. Absolutely. So, Anthony, this data is all really being mined, if you will. Where, can you just tell us how you go about doing that and then where you're mining the data from?
Totally. So we have a fantastic data team that stays on top of our sources, so to speak. They're making sure that the data that we're mining that's coming in, it's of the highest quality. They're active sources. They're, not really kind of divulging into topics that, our clients or for, our research purposes might not be helpful. So we kind of have that active growing, data that we tap into and kind of leverage, throughout the year. In terms of this category, talking about cannabis, it really the biggest contributors for most categories too is Reddit. Reddit is just exploded in popularity in different users. I think the number of subreddits is past 3 million now. And so that's a very large contributor to the cannabis conversation online. So subreddits like Our Trees, Our Weed, Our Oil Pen, all big contributors to this conversation. We're also grabbing from other cannabis forums like Roll It Up or Grass City, places, again, where folks are going there specifically to talk about cannabis. But what's interesting is, and this is not just for cannabis sources, but people will go on a source to talk about, a parenting community, but they'll talk about all different kinds of things under the sun. So really, we don't like to limit our sources to just what we're looking at because consumers are having conversations about all different types of topics within forums specific to all different types of topics.
Right.
We have a comment in the chat I just want to call out from Nikki Lawley. Welcome back, Nikki. One of Fast Acting in Boston are the first edibles that have ever worked for me. I usually smoke pre-rolls. So we have a firsthand experience related to what we're discussing. Thanks for sharing, Nikki.
Along those lines too, I don't usually share about my consumption, but I found myself on the road recently and somebody handed me an edible. And to my surprise, I don't know, 45 minutes later, I was giggling in a way that I hadn't giggled since probably the first time or close to the first time of consuming when I was, I guess, first going into college. So it does affect people differently, and it does bring back, either bring back nostalgic feelings or create new feelings for those that haven't consumed in that type of form factor.
Cool. I have a question for you, Anthony, related to how you're like working with brands and how you make recommendations. What we shared earlier was from 2021, looking at the first half to the second half. How far back can you go with this social analytics? And is there like what recommendations do you make for the brands that you're working with about how far back they should look?
Totally. So we typically go back 3 years. In some cases, we'll go back further. But, the reason why we recommend 3 years, particularly now and for the next, half a year, is because given all the drastic changes that happened, at the onset of COVID, the first year of COVID, and then, this post-COVID world that we're living in now, 3 years gives us the visibility into behaviors before COVID, that first year, and then the world we're living in now. And so we find a lot of our clients really appreciate that historical context that we're able to give across those 3 different phases.
Super interesting.
Yeah, and it also seems to me that if you're able to look at this in a timeline and sort of overlay that with real world things, that are taking place, you're able to better understand how people respond to certain things and then therefore predict certain things based on past responses.
Absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, what we're doing is we're shedding light into where consumers' minds are at. And in order to paint that full picture of where their minds are, we need the context for where they were before they got to the point they are today. And so looking at it from a historical perspective really helps us paint a full picture of how things are changing and how we got to where we are today. And it's incredibly helpful in my experience, having that historical context.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Boy, I'd love to dig into that more, but why don't we move on to the next slide? And if we have time, we could come back. And if anybody has any questions along the lines, please feel free to drop questions in as well. So this was a question for you, a CANNAchoice question for you. Which of the following product categories is up 16% from the first half of 2021 to the second half of 2021 for social camaraderie? And again, Anthony, if you don't, would you define social camaraderie?
Totally. So social camaraderie, the way to think about that, any sort of interaction that involves those around you. So mentions of going to a party, hanging out with friends, being with others, communicating or using expressive language where it's like, we all should. All good examples of those triggers underneath social camaraderie.
Okay, cool. Thank you. So that said, which of the following product categories is up 16%? Folks, please feel free to drop your answer, your choice in the chat. The answers are number A, or I should say letter A, concentrates, letter B, edibles, letter C, flower, and or letter, I should say, or D, vape. It's not multiple choice here. What does everybody think?
I can tell by the pause that this one is not as obvious as the first one.
Well, they still have a 25% chance of winning.
I think this one might be a stumper.
Okay, let's go to the answer. Oh, we got a C. We got a D.
Aaron Zeigler guessed D, vape. Nikki Lawley guessed C, flower. Both really good guesses.
Yep. Both with the 25% chance.
We have 2 more votes for vape and 2 more votes for flower and 1 vote for D, vape.
Yeah.
And the answer is?
The answer is flower. Yes, flower has increased as well. And so here's a quote that, an anecdotal quote. I'll maybe have a beer or 2, so I always make sure to bring a couple of joints to share as my contribution to the party. and also to be able to smoke myself. So that's somebody that's not only looking after their friends, but looking after themselves as well. And also might even give insight into this bifurcation of, are there drinkers, are there cannabis consumers, and perhaps there's this non-mutually exclusive crowd which overlaps both. So it's interesting, but here we can see there was an increase in flower.
Question for Anthony. Do you think any of that was driven by, during COVID, which was in 2021 or 2020 when the initial shutdown happened, people are starting to become more social in general, and where it might have been really taboo to, for example, share a joint with somebody in 2020, in 2021, that became a more acceptable custom again?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's funny that you mentioned that question in particular, because in that thread, I actually read someone talking about that exact thing, about the tabooness of sharing a joint in today's world, having gone through COVID. But I think that overall, what we're seeing is that a lot of those initial shocks and those drastic changes to our social lives, folks are starting to warm up again, and if they haven't already, to kind of being together and kind of having that social aspect. And it's still in the back of consumers' minds, thinking about where we were back in 2020, but definitely noticing a bit easing as far as the stigma around that type of thing.
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting when you think about that. So if people don't share joints, then they're rolling more joints, which then causes an increase, right, in consumption. But also too, during the pandemic, I thought it was really interesting. I thought it was interesting just in terms of people not wanting to go out, so they'd go out and they'd buy more, and really this was sort of brands started to come out. I guess Old Pal came out with a pack. Baker came out with a pack, and when I say a pack, sort of a larger pack with papers in them. But to a certain degree, I want hesitant. I don't want to include necessarily Old Pal in this, but there were value brands, if you will, starting up during the pandemic because people were buying more in one single drive-through or pass.
That was the rise of the dog walker, the little mini joint, affectionately termed the dog walker, because it's a single use. You're not meant to share it.
Right. Yep. So people could get out and come back really quickly and still do their thing. So again, I think this just shows that there's many data points and many things driving different trends and how people respond to them. So Anthony, I know you work with lots of brands and lots of clients. Are there any certain categories that work better with data mining and and social analytics? It seems to me that one of the biggest issues, especially in the cannabis space, is people don't necessarily know how to market. They don't know where to market or how to market, or as the rules are changing on all these platforms. So could you give us insight into, I don't know, the nuances and the differences between a cannabis company and others, and how we can do the best we can do with what we have?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'd say in the online space, it's very largely category agnostic. I'd mentioned over 3 million subreddits currently, and that number is going to continue to grow. And, that's 3 million different topics people are kind of congregating around. I think all that is to say that there's a wealth of information that consumers are willingly putting out there, kind of under that guise of anonymity in the online space. And so looking at cannabis in particular, this includes medical cannabis conversations, recreational cannabis conversations, moms who smoke weed, baby boomers trying cannabis for the first time. A lot of different audiences are, in that online space having these conversations. Now, the one thing I'll say is, admittedly, certain small to medium-sized brands don't always get that traction online that we might see for a larger brand. But, more times than not, when it comes to product categories or categories in general, or even kind of looking at certain audiences, in the online space offers a really good opportunity to kind of get a quick, fast look into attitudes, beliefs, motivations, etc., of those types of consumers. Mm-hmm.
And that's huge, especially especially as we. I always talk about these concentric rings, right? There's the kind of core in the middle, and it just from the kind of core, the kind of comfortable, the kind of curious, the kind of neutral, the kind of contra, right? And it's how do we speak to those people differently, and what are the different tones that are showing up, and then the different segments that are within the the different rings, if you will. There's lots to dissect here, but it really comes back to how can we leverage that to to educate and to normalize.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you bring up a good point too. I mean, one of the beauties of the online space is that we see conversations that in certain contexts that consumers wouldn't be willing to have if they were directly asked a question, right? There is that guise of, I'm user whatever on Reddit and I'm speaking more freely because no one knows who I am, what I do, where I live, versus, being a part of, a focus group or being directly asked about your experience about a certain topic. And so there's a certain degree that consumers are more willing to share kind of freely, or, they're not really watching what they say as much as they might in other contexts of research or just day-to-day kind of conversations or interactions.
Yeah, that's something we've seen too, like in doing focus groups or interviews or asking people to answer surveys.
Mm-hmm.
That sort of like level of anonymity for some people is really important, especially in the earlier days when we still had a bigger stigma to overcome, and being open about your consumption wasn't as prevalent. But the most fascinating studies that we've done have been with people who were like doing a chat versus showing their face on camera, because they were really able to be themselves and speak freely. So it's cool to be able to like take down some of those barriers and really get at the heart of what they're experiencing.
Totally.
And if anyone has a question for Anthony or just any kind of question, feel free to drop it in the chat. And I have a question for you, which is about influencing conversations online. Do you see in your analysis work that ad campaigns or paid media influence these types of conversations?
Totally. So, I don't want this to come off like a cop off or copping out of your question, but it really kind of depends on the brand and the campaign. I'll give you a quick example of, a very well received and discussed campaign, right? Back in 2018, Nike, they brought in Colin Kaepernick to make a very bold message about their brand and their stance on, social equity. And, in the online space, that made a huge impact. And we absolutely saw it and kind of, saw the effects of what that impact was. And it wasn't just people talking about about Colin Kaepernick and the ad itself. They're tying that back into, the Nike brand and their, whether or not they might go purchase or boycott, perceptions about how they were viewing that band. So I think it really comes down to, whether or not that advertisement or campaign is ultimately resonating with consumers, so much so that it's leaving this impression that consumers really feel the need to then discuss, how they feel about the brand or what that campaign made them feel like. I think day to day we interact with countless of different brands, whether we explicitly realize it or not. And, I think that when brands leave their mark, we're more likely to then tell others about that brand and how it left its mark. Or when you see kind of a campaign or, some sort of form of advertising that really kind of speaks to you or kind of draws you in, that's going to ultimately translate to purchasing that product, telling others about what you saw and your experience when you kind of interacted with that brand. So ultimately, in the online space, we're able to pick up on a lot of that because it's, again, focusing on those like brands that leave the mark, campaigns that leave the mark. And so it's a really good place for us to identify when that does occur.
That's really interesting too. And sometimes you could see like a certain keyword, like I don't have a good example of this, but a brand would start to describe an experience of their product, and then consumers pick up on that phrasing and it becomes more common. I'm sure we could think of an example, but that's
Right.
just what reminded me of that.
You know, Anthony, you mentioned Colin Kaepernick, you mentioned Nike, you mentioned social equity or inequity. You know, there's lots of things that were sort of tied to that all at the same time, really way above and beyond a brand, right? You know, there's there's patriotism involved. There's you know, what the National Football League is doing, what Nike the brand is doing, what's taking place in, you know, in the social world. How important are those types of things? You know, in maybe placing the brand in a certain place at the right time, under the right circumstances, like all those other social things that are happening.
Totally. You know, consumers are smart and they kind of see through BS, right? And so when those times do happen, they're looking for that authentic expression, and ultimately looking for brands that ultimately meet them at that moment that they're expecting them to. And so, you know, a lot of our work here at Social Analytics, it's really more around not necessarily that first level of functional needs that we as consumers look for, that those higher order values that the brands we're interacting with and being loyal to, whether or not they're meeting us. You know, I think there's a lot of really good examples of lifestyle brands that meet us kind of at that higher order level. Brands, you know, like Ben and Jerry's that might, you know, stand for something, and they make pretty good ice cream too, but they stand for something and that's what brings people in. So they're incredibly powerful in you know, driving us to interact with them and kind of, you know, become loyal or advocates, you know, advocate their brand to others.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, we see that in cannabis too. There's a lot of like social justice based branding, cause based branding, and it sounds like it really works.
Totally.
If it's coming from an authentic place.
And you know, it's funny you just mentioned Ben and Jerry's. To my surprise, I just found out that Jerry has his own brand on the East Coast in Massachusetts and Vermont as well. So it's interesting, but that ties back into what they've always done. And Adriana, to your point, I mean, Farmer and the Felon, Justice Joints, 40 Tons. I could keep going. There's lots of you know, cause-related brands.
Totally.
Well, cool. Let's shift focus for a sec and jump into our last stat of the day, if everybody's ready to check it out. Okay, so this one is a little bit different. Instead of guessing the category, this time we're going to guess the topic that conversations about this category revolved around. So from the first half of 2021 to the second half of 2021, the topic of blank was up 20% in conversations about concentrates. And there are 4 answer choices here. A, flavor, B, purity, C, solvents, or D, consistency. So what we're guessing is the topic that people discussed when they were talking about concentrates online. And we have one guess that just popped in, which is C for solvents. Okay, good guess. Let's see what other guesses we have. And this is an interesting topic because I think like with concentrates, there are so many aspects to it, right? People are interested in how it's made. It's not necessarily so intuitive that it comes from a certain process. And I think consumers are just sort of curious how it's made, what goes into it, what do you do with it, what makes it a good concentrate, can I trust the brand? Lots of interesting conversations in this category. We have a few more guesses coming in. Kevin Rothman guessed B for purity. Cheryl Bouchard guessed D, consistency. Deborah V guessed B, purity. John Alarcon guessed B. Aaron Zyglis guessed B. Also, we've got a lot of consensus here for B. Nancy Dominicelli, I'm so sorry if I mispronounced your name, guessed A for flavor. And Vanessa Aguirre guessed D for consistency.
Yeah.
Thank you for your guesses.
seems like people are pretty unified in purity.
I think B is the top choice, probably followed by D, consistency.
And Charlene as well, B for purity. It's interesting because everybody always talks about, how something is being, extracted or concentrated, and people are really all over the map in terms of what they're talking about. And I'm sure, my sense is this conversation sort of goes into the nerdy area of the cannabis cultivator extractor, and then sort of comes back out a little bit to the the folks that are interested in concentrates. But it's definitely a nerdy community of concentrate folks and experts, and that's a compliment. I don't mean that anything but a compliment. So the answer is
Purity. Nice job, everybody. That was a really good analysis. Most people guessed it right.
Good guess, Kevin.
Should we read the quote? Let's do it. Check out that red dab full of flavonoids. I don't know how to pronounce his name. Sorry. Anthocyanins, another step in our new process. This is whole cannabis bud pressed using rosin tech only. Nothing added but pure organic cannabis nugs. Interesting.
Right. So tell me that's not nerdy or geeky. That
Right.
quote, right? Anthocyanins, come on. Very, very interesting. So
I bet if you put concentrates consumers up against consumers across categories, even outside of cannabis, they would be in the top 5 percentile for the most knowledgeable about the products. Like they just really know a lot about it and are really just interested and curious about all the things that go into making what's sort of a complex product.
That's right. They definitely geek out on it. And if you're consuming concentrates, you're a serious consumer, which means more often than not you're a connoisseur, right? So it's interesting to see that, and it's also an opportunity for brands to understand that about those consumers and to really leverage that. Educate them about the things they want to know. Talk to them about the processes, all of the things that a nerd or a geek wants to hear. And I'd also say, Anthony, like coming back quickly, doesn't that sort of apply back to community? It's sort of, I don't know, you're on the inside of a community, you can relate to people, you can share things, you can share secrets with that community or talk in ways that you wouldn't with others. I mean, so it really harkens back to, I think, some of the things that are most basic, to humans.
Yeah.
So just
sorry about that. I was just going to add too. I think you hit the nail right on the head. In these communities, when you're talking to folks about these things, what we're seeing come through are those basic expressions of emotion, motivations, drivers, all things that we're able to kind of read through that.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So if you don't mind, I kind of alluded to it earlier, when you spoke about Nike, but what are the contributing factors to these indicators or these trends or these things that are popping up online that we see that we can sort of figure out tone or figure out where our consumers or potential consumers are coming from? What makes that happen? What should we be looking for?
Yeah, I think what we should be looking for are, it's, and I kind of just mentioned it, it all comes back to, these shifts in how we're behaving as consumers. I mean, at the end of the day, we're ultimately providing a megaphone for consumers to kind of reach the brands in terms of what they're saying. And so in terms of what we should be looking for, it's behavioral shifts. It's changing kind of what consumers want out of the cannabis experience. It's seismic shifts like COVID and measuring the reaction to such seismic shifts. It's then, following COVID a year plus afterward, it's seeing what remnants of COVID still exist in that conversation. Because, I think that by and large, because what we do is so consumer centric, we're ultimately very much tied into behavior changes and how the world around us are impacting, the way that we're discussing our interactions with brands and categories.
And let's talk a little bit about like some context. I know we have one more slide to show that we'll have Anthony speak to a little bit that can explain a little bit more about those drivers that we just mentioned and the sense of community, people using in language, feeling like you can speak freely with people who are other concentrates consumers, and you can have your nerd out community. I love nerds and consider myself a nerd too. So this is not no shade.
Yeah, what I'd say here is this wheel over here on the right, these drivers of human behavior. At its core, these are fundamental ways that we talk about our experiences, whether it's at a brand level or a category level. And so I guess, going back to your question, David, these kind of 12 different experience archetypes, right? Ultimately, what we're capturing there are triggers to kind of tell us that a consumer is leaning into a certain experience or not. So, feel adventurous, for example, that was what indicated to me that in the edibles category, there was all this conversation about trying something new or wanting a different experience. Feeling adventurous in the sense that you're kind of stepping outside of your comfort zone. And so looking at it at online conversation from the lens of these triggers, it's a very effective and efficient way for us to essentially understand what those motivating factors are that are driving the experiences that consumers are having with different brands, cannabis product categories, etc.
This is really great because as a brand builder, I'm always looking for different hooks to really tie into communities, right? But I never really thought about it in this way. Like how do I help my client's consumer feel accomplished or feel rebellious or feel smart? And if you can set those opportunities up for them to feel those ways, then you have a stronger brand, you have a more loyal customer.
Totally. And, this is, based off a lot of research. There was a book written about it, The Hero and the Outlaw, which we kind of brought in and kind of adapted for our own purposes of analyzing online conversation. I think that one of the biggest points that book talks about is how every successful brand ultimately aligns itself in one of these key areas. You mentioned feel accomplished. That's something that Red Bull does a great job of. It is a brand that ultimately is tied to that sense of putting the work in and seeing the results. Across this wheel, I could go, I think, on and on about what those different brand examples are. But I think the point I'm trying to make is that the best brands identify, that experience that their consumers are yearning for, and they meet them there at that level.
That's right. That's pretty amazing.
This is so cool and so interesting. I don't necessarily want to steal the last spot of asking a question. So if anyone in the audience would like to ask one, please feel free. But if you don't, then I will chime in and give Anthony one last question. Well, okay, I'll go ahead and do it then. Thinking about what's happening for the rest of 2022 and thinking about the growth of the cannabis category in general, what do you see? Maybe you could look into your crystal ball or mad scientist test tube and tell us what you think will continue to be a trend or what you think might sort of die off. Any predictions?
Yeah. So, I think it's hard to ignore the changes that are going on the product side, right? We know that in certain markets, flower is losing market share to other product categories. We also know that the price of flower in recent months has gone down, which is indicative of, there might be more supply than there is demand for that flower category. But I didn't come here to talk about the product side. Let's talk about what's changing with consumers in that. And I think ultimately what we're seeing today is a more complex and diverse consumer base than we had before COVID. And what I mean by that, not necessarily, or what I mean by complex and diverse is more so about motivations, behaviors, emotions being expressed, reasons why they're coming into the category. It's a lot more of a different consumer base than it was, before COVID hit. And, one of the impacts that COVID had is it had this great reevaluation of a lot of different aspects of our life. The things that we did, what we wanted to do for work, how we approached our holistic wellness or, our fitness. And I think that in cannabis, it's not immune to those changes that occurred. I think what we're seeing online is that, some folks want to get the purest form of THC possible, and they don't want to have to worry about other contributing factors that might be inside that concentrate. Others are getting bored with an experience that they've had over and over again. They want to try something new. Or other people are wanting to come into the category that have never tried it, but are now more open to trying it because of its implication or impact on their health and wellness. So I guess my point is that I expect consumers to be more diverse in terms of these attitudes, behaviors, motivations as we move throughout 2022. And consumers to increasingly seek out the brands that kind of meet them at, these desired experiences that they're looking out for.
Yeah, it seems like that wheel that you just showed, there could be a brand, a cannabis brand that occupies each one of those spaces because it's so diverse in terms of what products can be created out of it and what branded experiences can be created out of it. So it's cool to see that evolve and change over time.
Totally.
It is. And, for me, in my book, I created the 14 cannabis brand archetypes. What I love about this is that this is really, so there are customer personas, and we've talked about them before, and then there are brand archetypes. But what this is really the glue that holds those two things together about how the customer feels. And that's something which is really interesting to get into and to dive into and to better understand. That's what makes a great brand, right?
I think we have the trifecta here.
That's right, we do.
We'll have to again, Anthony, and dig into more of this.
I'd love to. That sounds great.
Absolutely. Well, for those folks that are listening, and for those folks that will stumble upon this at a later point too, that slide is something that everybody should study and learn and think about, relative to their brands. Anthony, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. Your insight, your approach, and understanding of cannabis consumers has been really helpful to us and really thoughtful, and makes me leaving that I need to think a little bit more about some of the glue I spoke about earlier that you brought to the surface. So thank you so much for that. I really appreciate that. Adriana, I want to thank you as always for being a great co-host, and everybody that's joined us. Thank you so much for participating. We're really excited to have you every week. And to the folks that support us behind the scenes as well. Thank you so much. Do you want to introduce our next guest?
Yeah, absolutely. So next Friday, which is May 13th, we will be inviting Rick Gillis onto CANNAfact Friday, who is the president of the Tinley Beverage Company. Rick is such a sweet guy and was so kind to give us a tour of his manufacturing facility, which was utterly fascinating. So he will be coming on to talk about cannabis beverages. We'll be sharing some stats related to who is the cannabis beverage consumer, what do we know about them, what experiences are they looking for, and Rick will provide some expert commentary to help round out that conversation.
Absolutely, that's going to be a great conversation. He's super knowledgeable and can school us all. We want to just take a quick thank you before Anthony goes. Anthony, thank you so much again for sharing all the information you did. We're really excited to hear from you again in the future and to have you back on as our guest. And as always, thank you for supplying us with the data that we often talk about. We appreciate that.
Of course, yes. Thank you both for having me this week. This was a great conversation, and yes, I'm looking forward to future ones. So thank you.
Nice.
Thank you. Well, for those folks that want to hear more about what we're doing, you can check out our CANNAfact Friday newsletter, and you can sign up for it. You can see it on the screen right here. There's also a link in the chat, so please click on that, and then follow that through, click on attend, and you'll get the notification for next week's CANNAfact Friday, episode number 16.
It's going to be a great one, and thank you to Lorelei, who said, thanks for taking the time to share your insights, facts, and nuggets with us. I love that pun there. Kevin said, Anthony, very impressive. Great guest, a lot of knowledge. Thanks, everybody. Have a great weekend. It's been so fun spending time with you today.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great weekend. See you next CANNAfact Friday, and thanks for joining us. Bye.